professor. I often lecture, and sometimes in the United States, we call them pop quizzes. Those are short tests that we give to make sure that the students or the audience is listening. So this morning we'll have some pop quizzes during my talk. I'm going to talk this morning about the findings that we have from the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, otherwise known as BEIP. But before I do, I'm going to review for just a few minutes some of the concepts that I talked about yesterday. So, sensitive periods. Everybody remember about sensitive periods, I hope, right? Let's just go over that. These are time-limited periods during which the effect of experience on the brain is particularly strong. They allow experience to instruct neural circuits to process information in an adaptive way. And they provide information that is essential for normal development and may alter performance permanently. Now, this is a diagram that both Professor Nelson and I showed yesterday, and it shows the different periods of time when because there are many critical periods, right? It's not just one. There are many critical periods, and it depends upon the information and the experience that the brain is receiving in terms of the wiring that occurs in the brain. Okay, so first pop quiz, first question this morning. Who is that? Anybody remember? No? Konrad Lorenz. He was an ethologist, and he talked about imprinting. Those are the baby ducklings, and I told you a little bit about that. Yesterday. Okay, next pop quiz. Hubel and Wiesel. They were the neuroscientists who studied kittens and showed that there were critical periods in the development of the part of the brain that processes visual information. And not only was it important what type of information that the brain received, but it was also important when the brain received that information. Okay, that's it for the pop quizzes. Let me describe very briefly the structure of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. Professor Nelson talked about it yesterday, but let me go over it just very briefly this morning. When we worked in Bucharest, Romania, in Bucharest, the city is divided into 6 sectors, and each sector had an institution. We went to all 6 of these institutions, and we screened all of the infants and very young children who were under the age of 3. We screened them for those infants who may have a developmental disability, some sort of genetic problem, or some physical problem like cerebral palsy. And those infants and young children were excluded from the study. That left us with 136 children between the ages of 6 and 30 months of age. And we assessed those infants and children in our laboratory in Bucharest. After they were assessed, they were randomized to either be taken out of the institution and placed into a foster family, or to remain in the institutions where they were living. We did not randomize an infant or young child to be placed in an institution. They were all living in an institution at the time of our first assessment and at the time of randomization. So half of the children went into families. We call that the foster care group. And half of the children remained in the institutions where they were living. While the foster families that we selected were supported by our research, by our project. They got psychological assistance, they got social work assistance, they got financial assistance. We supported them during the first part of the study until each child was 54 months of age, at which point in time our support of the families ended and the government of Romania took over the support of these foster families. We have followed those children since that point in time. It says there that we follow them up through 12 years of age, but we actually just finished the assessment of these children when they were age 16. And we're hoping to see them now when they are 20 or 21 as adults and to see where they are. Now, as Professor Nelson mentioned, we had many different measures of assessment during this period of time. I won't have a chance in my talk to present all of that. In fact, Professor Nelson, Zina, and I have divided up the findings of the Bucharest study, and I'll start and I'll talk about language, cognition, emotional reactivity, executive function, and stress reactivity. The other thing that I want to mention before I start is that if you remember from Professor Nelson's talk, what happened over the course of the study is that many children, if not most of the children who were randomized to remain in the institutions, most of them left the institutions over the course of the first 8 years of our study. There were only 10 or 15 who remained in the institution by the time the children were 8 years old. They either went into government foster care because they started government foster care after our study began, or they went back to the biological family, or they were adopted by a family in Romania or even internationally. So there were many different transitions of these children over the course of the study, in both the foster care group and also in what we call the care as usual group. But the data that I am going to present to you this morning, we use an approach that I believe Professor Nelson mentioned called intent to treat. And that is, I'm going to analyze the data as if the child remained in the foster care group or as if the child remained in the institution. Now, I do that because it's easy for us at any one age, when we do it that way, to compare the performance of a child in the foster care group to a child in the care as usual group. All I have to do is look at the two groups and do what's called in statistics a t-test, very simple, and I can see whether there's a difference in performance between these two groups. It's also a very conservative approach because obviously, as I mentioned, many of the children in foster care left our foster care group and went someplace else, and many of the children who were randomized to remain in the institution were no longer there. So it is a conservative estimate of the effect of this intervention early on the child's life. Okay. With that introduction, let me go through some of the data. So the first measure that I'm going to very briefly talk about is language. Oh, I do want to mention one other thing. One of the important elements of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project is that the infants and children that we recruited and assessed while they were still all living in the institution, they varied in their ages from 6 to 30 months at the time that they were randomized to one of these two groups. So what does that mean? If you were a child that was placed into foster care and you were 10 months old, right? Or if you're a child who was placed into foster care and you're 24 months old, then when we assess you when you are 42 months old, right, then we can compare the age at which the child entered into foster care and see whether or not the amount of intervention or the age of placement into foster care mattered in terms of the effect of the intervention. And in that way, we are able to see whether or not there was a sensitive period or a critical period during which, for a particular domain, the intervention had its greatest effect. Let me show you the first piece of data, and maybe it will become clear about what I'm talking about. Okay. So here you see the age of placement of different subgroups of the children at 42 months of age. So the children are 42 months, that's 3.5 years old, and we assess their language. We assess both their expressive language and their receptive language. Receptive language is in red, expressive language is in gray. And what I've done here in this graph is I've divided up the children in the foster care group into the age at which they were placed into the intervention. My right, I guess your left, all the way over to the side there, you see the group called IG. Those are the children who were randomized to remain in the institution. So let me go through the graph. Oh, one other thing to say about this graph. The 0 line means that the child is performing at age level. So for these assessments, the child is performing like any typical child would be performing, okay? So what you can see there is that if a child was randomized to be placed into the foster care family before 15 months of age, then there's basically no statistical difference between that child's performance on either expressive or receptive language and a typical child. They're performing just fine. Going a little bit more now to my right, if the child is 1 month more, the children are older than 16 months of age, then they are performing somewhat more poorly on expressive and receptive language. If it's 2 years or 29 months of age, what you see is that already the children are no longer performing at age level. So children who are placed into the families at around a year of age are performing typically on these tests of language, but children who are placed after that, and particularly around 2 to 3 years of age, they are performing poorly on these tests of expressive and receptive language. There's an assessment called mean length of utterance, how much the type of vocabulary that a child has. And what you can see there on my left, the NIG, those are community children. Typical children from the Bucharest community, families with no history of institutionalization. And you see there in terms of words, the number of words that they are saying, and in terms of morphemes, syllables, how many syllables they are saying when they're talking. The red bar are morphemes, the black bar are words. Now, if you look at children who are placed into families before 2 years of age, you can see that there's no statistical difference between those children placed before 2 years of age and typical children from the community. But for children who are placed after 2 years of age, they are doing more poorly on these language measures. And in fact, if you look at the IG, which is all the way to the right, my right, your left, what you see is that the children who are placed after 2 years of age are doing similarly, performing similarly to the children who remained or who were randomized to remain in the institution. One more measure of language. Now we followed the children up, and now we're looking at their performance on reading. Okay? And now I've got 3 groups here. The 0 line that you see at the top there, that means typical performance like the community, like children from the community. The green bar, those are children that were placed into families before 2 years of age. And what you can see is that there's no difference between those children and typical performance by children in the community in terms of their reading. But if you look at the orange bar and the blue bar, the orange bar are children who are placed into families after 2 years of age, and the blue bar are the children that were randomized to remain in the institution. Now remember, this is intent to treat, so many of the children have left and there's been movement, but still what you see is that the effect, there appears to be a sensitive period for language and for reading, so that below the age of 2, being placed into a family has its greatest effect. The intervention has its greatest effect. Now, this theme that I'm telling you about, in terms of age 2 being a significant sensitive period for the effect of our intervention, you're going to see that over and over again in the data that I'm going to be presenting to you this morning. Okay, let's talk about IQ, right? When the children were infants and they were living in the institution, and then at 30 and 42 months, we used a measure that's called the Bailey Scales of Mental Development. I don't know if you're familiar with it. The Bailey is a measure of infant intelligence and very well normed. And I don't know whether it's been normed or used in Brazil or not, but it's a measure that was normed in Romania and that also has been used in the United States. When the children were 54 months of age, and we followed them, we changed from the Bailey and we used a measure called the WIPSI, which is a Wechsler IQ test, and similar to tests like the WISC, which are used with older children. So when we assess the children at baseline, all of the children are now living in the institution and have been living in the institution for more than half of their life. Remember, they're between the ages of 6 to 28, 29 months of age. This is what we found. Now, the Bailey is normed at 100, and standard deviation is 15. So 100 is normal, typical. 15 below 100 is 85 to 115. That's the majority of typical children. What you see here in green are the community children from Bucharest no history of institutionalization, they are performing at 100, just the typical level. The children who are all living in the institution are terribly delayed in terms of their mental performance. It's the MDI, Mental Developmental Index. They are at 64. Now, a standard deviation of 15, so 85 is typical. Below that is delayed and very delayed. And so you can see there that the majority of children who are living in the institution, when we assess them there, are significantly delayed in terms of their IQ. Now, I'm going to ask 2 questions for the rest of my talk. And I should have started this with the language, but here are the 2 questions. The first question is, when we do our randomization and we start our study, is there an effect of the intervention? Does the intervention work? The second question that I'll ask within the group of foster care children is there a sensitive period during which the intervention has its greatest effect? Those are my 2 questions here. So, to answer the first question, is there an intervention effect? We look at the children at 30 months, at 42 months, and at 54 months. The children who are placed into families are in red. The children who were randomized to remain where they were living in the institutions are in yellow. And what you could see is at each age, 30, 42, and 54 months, the children who were placed into families are doing significantly better on these measures of IQ compared to children who were living in the institutions. So I've answered my first question. Did the intervention work? And the answer is yes. Now let me ask my second question and answer my second question, which is there a timing effect? Right? How does IQ differ for children in foster care as a function of the age at which they were placed into the institution? And so here's what I did. I divided the children up into the age at which they were placed into families. And what you can see here is that there's a clear cut point. If you were placed into a family before 2 years of age, before 24 months of age, then you have a typical normal IQ when we follow you up. This is at 54 months of age. But if you were placed into a family after 2 years of age, then your IQ among our foster care children is significantly lower. Okay? So I've answered my second question. Yes, there appears to be a critical period. However, as Professor Nelson told you yesterday, there was, and as I mentioned to you, there was a great deal of movement of children from the foster care group out, from the institution out. And so when we follow the children up at age 8, here's what we find. We no longer have on my left, your right, the significant intervention effect of full-scale IQ. It's in the right direction, with the green being the children who were randomized to be in foster care, the blue being the children who were randomized to be in the institution. We do see on my right, all the way to my right, all the way to your left here, that the children who are randomized to be in the institution, in the foster care families, are doing significantly better on verbal performance compared to the children who are randomized to be in the institution. So yes, there seems to be an intervention effect, although not as strong as it was when the children were younger. So now what we do is we break intent to treat, and we reshuffle the children to put the children who were continued to live in the families that we place them into. That's the green. The green bars are the children that remained in the families that we placed them in. Now, this is at 8 years of age. So the randomization took place when the children were around 2 years of age. So it's 6 years later. And what does this tell us? It tells us that if a child remained in the home that we placed them into, that has as much importance as it does to whether or not the child was in the intervention. There's no timing effect here, but it's stability of placement as well as early placement that appears to matter. Finally, if we look at the children at age 12, you can see here the yellow are the children who were randomized to be in foster care. The gray bars are the children randomized to be in care as usual. And what you can see here is that there's an intervention effect. This is now 10 years later. The children are 12 years old. And what you can see here is that we still see an intervention effect among the children who are randomized to be in our intervention and into families. I do want to make a point here that you'll notice that I don't have a bar up there for the community children. And the reason for that is that if you look at the level, at the IQ level of the yellow bars, that's our foster care children, it's still lower, significantly lower, than what a typical child would be performing at 12 years of age. Now, one of the things that we did is we wanted to see about the stability of their IQ scores over time. And so you see we created 2 profiles there, one for foster care children who remained high over time, and one for foster care children who were basically low and getting lower over time. And we asked the question, what predicted remaining in a high profile over time? And you can see that there are 3 things. The first is the attachment status of the child at 42 months, whether the child showed a secure attachment at 42 months when we assessed them, the age at which the child was placed, if the child was placed before 2 years of age, and the number of disruptions, that is, the number of times that the child moved. For the children who remain in the high level over time, they had a more secure attachment, they were placed earlier, and they had fewer disruptions compared to children in the foster care group who had that low profile over time. Next, assessment. We were very much interested in the child's emotional reactivity. And so we used 2 easy tests when the children were living in the institution and then following them up. One of them was called puppets. You can see that on my right, your left. And the other one is called peekaboo. I'm sure you have peekaboo here in Brazil, right? And puppets, right? So the experimenter played with puppets with the child, and the experimenter did peekaboo with the child. We wanted to see if the children laughed and smiled and paid attention. Okay, we coded positive affect, negative affect, and attention. So here's what we found with all the children who were living in the institution at the time. This is at baseline. What you can see here, the gray bar are the community children. The blue bar are all the children living in the institution. And what you can see here is that while the community children are showing a lot of smiling and laughter, the institutionalized children are not. And so that concerned us quite a bit. Now, when we look at the effect of foster care on positive affect, what we find at 30 months and at 42 months is an immediate response to the intervention. That is, it's not very clear, but the lighter blue bars, those are the children in foster care, and the darker blue bars are the children who were randomized to be in the institution. And what this shows you is that there was no timing effect. As soon as we placed the child into a family, their affect changed. They became happier and more responsive to the situation. And in fact, the amount of negative affect decreased as well, and the amount of attention that they paid to the puppets and the peekaboo also increased for the children who were placed into families compared to the children who remained in the institution. Okay, so an interim summary: young children living in institutions show significant delays in language, cognition, attention, and positive affect. Removing children from institutions, particularly prior to 2 years of age, and placement into families seems to remediate these IQ deficits. Removal from institutions in the first years is related to language. Stability of placement is an important factor in IQ. And remarkably, 10 years after the intervention, there are still positive effects on IQ. And positive affect and attention respond immediately to placement in a family. Let me go on to the next set of findings, and that is on executive function. For those of you who were here yesterday and heard my talk, you heard me talk about the air traffic control system and executive functions, yes? So we use the measure to assess the children's executive functions and to see whether or not those executive functions increased as a function of the intervention. When we looked early on in life, we found no significant effect of our intervention and no timing. But when we start looking later on, starting at around age 8, we in fact find that there are significant intervention effects on executive functions. And you can see here 2 of our different tasks that we use. And what you can see here is that the green it's showing up as gray, and the blue and the orange, those are the children randomized to the institution and randomized to foster care. So you can see here is that while everybody is getting better, the children who were placed into our families do not appear to be doing any better than the children that were randomized to the institution. When we look at another set of measures here, working memory, what we find here is that the children who were placed into foster care, that's the orange line, they appear to be getting better over this period of time. And here you can see the same thing, that the children who are placed into foster care appear to be doing better, but it's taking a very long time, almost 16 years, for their performance to increase. I can also show you here, this is a complicated slide, but let me just say that the care as usual children, that's the children randomized to the institution, they are performing worse on these executive functions, and it's related to their brain activity. The children in foster care are somewhere in between, and the green bar, those are community children who are performing typically. The last piece of data that I'm going to show you this morning is about what we call stress responsivity. Now let me introduce this by making the following comments. We were wondering and asking, why is it? What is it about the institution? We know that that living in an institution and having this early adversity affects secure attachment and affects the child's social relationships. But what is it mechanistically that is occurring physiologically and in the brain that is causing these deficits that we see in the institutionalized sample? And can we see remediation improvement in the children who we place into our institution. And so the area that we have studied quite intensively is stress and stress reactivity. Remember, I talked about toxic stress yesterday and the effect of toxic stress on the brain. And so here we are trying to assess whether or not that there is toxic stress in the children who are in the institution and what effect that had upon their stress reactivity. There is evidence from other research that being with a caregiver and in a family buffers toxic stress, and I mentioned some of that yesterday. And so we wanted to see whether or not that was true in our sample. So in order to do that, being good experimental psychologists, we came up with a task which is called the Trier Social Stress Test. And let me just briefly describe to you what it is. The child, these are children now, our children in our sample, who are 12 years old. They come into our laboratory and they're told that they are going to have to give a speech. They're going to have to give a speech about their favorite moment and what they want to do when they grow up. They have 5 minutes to prepare that speech, and then they have to give the speech in front of 2 people who they don't know, who are wearing white coats, who are holding on to pads of paper, and who are writing down and being critical of them while they are giving the speech. That's very stressful. We then, after they do that, we then say to them, okay, we're going to give you a number, and we want you to count backwards with that number by 7s as fast as you can. So you have the number 983. You have to count backwards by 7s. Ready, set, go. And they're timed to see how they're doing. That's stressful. So what did we do while they were doing all of these things? We took, during all of these different periods of times, we took saliva from their mouths to get a measure of their hormone called cortisol to see about their stress. We also measured their heart rate variability, their blood pressure. As I say, we took their saliva, and we asked the question, how do the children in our cohort, in our sample, respond to these stressors? We also did the same test on a group of community children who have no history of institutionalization. Okay, and we asked the question, how do the children respond with their heart rate, with their blood pressure, with their arousal to this particular set of stressors? So here's what we found. I'm going to show you the first graph, and I'll explain it. There's the prep, means the time for the preparation of the speech. Then there's the speech, and then there's the math. And I've described to you what the child has to do during all of those. The black bar, those are the children from the community. The gray bar, those are the children who were randomized to be taken out and placed into families. The white bar are the children that were randomized to remain in the institution. Now, they're 12 years old. Randomization occurred when they were between 2 and 3 years of age. So this is 10 years later that we are assessing their stress reactivity. And what do you see? Well, it's pretty clear. The community children are very stressed, as they should be. The experiment is working. When we ask them to give a speech, when we ask them to count backwards with their math, the community children are very stressed. So their heart rate goes up. The children who are living in the institutions show very little heart rate response at all, very little stress response. And the children in the foster care, the children who are in our families, are somewhere in between. Now, this pattern is true about all of our measures. So, for example, if I look at blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, you can see the same pattern. It's also true for sympathetic reactivity. They're not getting aroused. The children who are in the institutions are not showing a typical stress response, whereas the children who are in the community are, and the children in our intervention are somewhere in between. Now, when we ask the question about cortisol reactivity, that is stress reactivity, here's what we find for our three groups. The solid black line, those are the community children, and they are showing a typical stress response. Their cortisol goes up when they're getting stressed, and then afterwards it comes down. But what you see there is for the two groups of children, they are flat. They're showing no response whatsoever, both the foster care children and the children who were randomized to remain in the institution. But wait, what about the timing in which we place the child into the foster family, right? That's always my second question here, the timing of placement. And if you look at that, this is in the foster care children. The children who are placed before 24 months of age, that's the solid black line. The children who are placed after 24 months of age, that's the dotted line. And what you can see here is that the children who are placed before 24 months of age, they are showing a typical normal response. I'm going to go backwards here. There you see, that's the community group, right? Now I'll go forwards. And there's the foster care group that was taken out before 2 years of age. They're identical. They are showing the identical stress reactivity response. So the stress reactivity seems to be a function not only of the intervention, but also the timing of placement. And that's true both about cortisol, and it's also true about autonomic reactivity as well. So the interim conclusion here is that deprivation is associated with a blunted response to stress in autonomic activity and in stress reactivity with cortisol. Random assignment to high-quality foster care following institutionalization seems to remediate these effects of the stress system. But most importantly is that earlier placement into foster care leads to normalization of the cortisol response and of the autonomic response. So the conclusions to my talk this morning. Institutional rearing increases risk for serious impairments and delays in most of the domains that I have presented to you this morning. High-quality foster care reduces, but does not eliminate totally, developmental delays. Earlier placement into high-quality foster care leads to more recovery. And quality of the foster care matters, as does the stability of the foster care over time. Those are the messages that I leave you with in my talk this morning. Thank you.